My name's Neil Ferguson. I'm the Head of Corporate Functions at Revenue Scotland and a member of the senior leadership team. I've been with Revenue Scotland almost 10 years. I joined during the first year of operation, and prior to that, I suppose my career has been kind of wound in with all the constitutional change that has led to devolved taxes in Scotland. Devolved taxes that we have, you can trace them back almost about 2007, 2009, when the Calman Commission reported and recommended that Scotland should have further legislative competence devolved to it to have some of its own taxes and collect and manage taxation. Prior to that, the Scottish Government had no tax raising powers of its own. And so the Calman Commission's report eventually led to the Scotland Act of 2012, which devolved that competence for two areas of tax, which in turn led to a legislative programme that went through the Scottish Parliament to provide for a land and buildings transaction tax and a Scottish landfill tax. And then there was a third act called the Revenue Scotland and Tax Powers Act in 2014, which established Revenue Scotland as Scotland's tax authority. And so the lights went on and we started collecting tax in 2015. And so this year, say we've been celebrating our 10 years of operation. So it's been quite a journey, and as I say, I've been involved in that 9 out of the 10 of the years, and to see the organisation grow, not just numerically, but in its capability and capacity over the years, has been absolutely fascinating. Actually, if you ever wanted to do a case study on how you start a public body, never mind a tax authority, from scratch and get over 10 years to the mature organisation that it now is, it would be a really good case study to look at. We started with about 40 plus staff. We now have around 100. We have 9 professions within the organisation, including our wonderful data team, our stats and MI team, which I'll come to in a minute. We've matured over the years greatly in developing our tax capability. We've delivered a hybrid model through the course of the COVID period, which is quite distinct from other organisations, I think. Over the last few years, we've had a settled leadership team, which has helped to provide some stability. We've done a huge amount of work in qualities and diversity. We've managed to maintain all our key performance indicators. We've been given substantial assurance by internal audit for the last 4 years running. And now our people survey results too are just outstanding. They're off the scale, which is terrific. We're up there in the very top cohorts of the civil service organisations, which is really super. And that's part of the work we've been doing on our culture, developing a culture in our organisation from scratch, as I say. So I'm still here probably because after all this time, because it's such a good organisation to be part of. I'm really feel we've really built something in Revenue Scotland and work with great people. And very capable people, really approachable people, and really enjoy the work that we do. And all of the revenues that we collect, ultimately, we should never forget, they go into the Scottish Consolidated Fund, but all of the revenues that we collect go to fund public services in Scotland. And that's a very much kind of core of what we're all about as an organisation. We work very closely with a number of different partners. We're accountable to the Scottish Parliament for a start, but we also work very closely with tax policy colleagues in Scottish Government, and we work very closely too with the Scottish Fiscal Commission, who have joined us today for this morning's webinar. So really grateful to everybody who has prepared material to share with us this morning. I was going to say it's going to be a bit like the Scotland-Denmark game, and that it'll be a game of 2 halves, but that probably didn't feel like a game of 2 halves the other night. I think it's more like the Scotland-Greece game, which probably was a game of 2 halves, where we got gubbed for the first half and came back strongly in the second. So the first half, we're going to look at the data that we've had from the devolved taxes over the last 10 years. So the Revenue Scotland team will take us through that and explain some of the trends in the data to us. And then we'll have time for some questions and discussion. So if anybody wants to contribute to that, by all means, you can do it in the chat, I think, or you can put your camera on and ask a question. Thereafter, we will look at the future, and the Fiscal Commission colleagues will take us through tax forecasts for the next few years in terms of where the taxes are going in the light of what we know at the moment anyway. And Revenue Scotland's story isn't finished yet, in the sense that although we've collected 2 taxes for the last 10 years, there are more taxes coming. So we have Scottish aggregates tax going live next April. And thereafter in 2028, the Minister announced on Tuesday, the Scottish Building Safety Levy will go live too. And at this point, we've also got a question as to whether and when your departure tax might take off. So that's part of our journey in the next few years, is delivering new taxes into the mix, and being responsible for the collection and management of these new ones. So lots more we could talk about, but I'll keep that introduction as brief as possible. We will record the presentations. We won't record the discussions, just so that you know. I should also mention, I suppose, that Revenue Scotland collects and manages the taxes. Scottish Government is responsible for the tax legislation, the policy, the setting of rates and bands, and the Fiscal Commission is responsible for tax forecasts, just to make that clear. But together they make up the kind of tax environment for Scotland's taxes, or the fully devolved taxes anyway, working together across the way, if you like. So I think that's probably enough for me. We're not anticipating any fire alarms. Oh, that's a different talk. So don't worry about that, because we're all online. But if there's any interruptions, or hopefully the technology will behave itself and we can just keep going through the course of the presentation. We'll have a wee break after the Revenue Scotland presentation. So without any further ado, I'll first of all introduce Dr. Andrew Morgan, who will take us through, or introduce the first session that we have on the data trends from the last 10 years. So thank you, Andrew. Over to you.
Hopefully everyone can see those now. I see some nods. It's funny, after 5 years, there's still that uncertainty about whether slides can still be seen when you share them. Never quite trust that button. Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming along. It's good to see the interest in our stats. Yeah, my name's Andrew Morgan, and I'm a statistician, and I lead the statistics team in Revenue Scotland. And I'm going to give a quick introduction about official stats before I pass over to my colleagues Bobby and Amida, who are going to present the interesting trends data. So as a quick start, I'm going to give you the aim and outline of this webinar. So the main aim of this webinar is to give an overview of trends in the two devolved taxes collected by Revenue Scotland over the past 10 years since our establishment in April 2015. And as you'll see, quite a lot has happened over those past 10 years. As Neil's kind of already mentioned, I should note that Revenue Scotland do not set tax policy or tax rates and bands. And this forum is kind of more to describe the trends in the taxes and discuss the drivers of trends. It'd be good to get some insight from you around those sort of drivers, looking at that rather than actually sort of critiquing the tax policy. And yeah, I'm going to start with a quick overview about official stats and what they are, and passing on to Bob and Amelia, who are going to cover land and building transaction tax trends and Scottish landfill tax trends as part of the talk. What I should note about what official stats are, the data presenting here is going to come from our annual, quarterly and monthly official statistics, which are available on our website if you haven't seen them. And basically, official stats are published by public bodies, and official stats should adhere to the 3 pillars laid out in the Scottish Code of in the official stats code of practice. And the 3 pillars are trustworthiness, and that means the public have confidence in the producers of stats. Kind of, in other words, published stats should be impartial and not subject to any undue influences, political or otherwise. The second pillar is quality, which is about using suitable data and appropriate methods to produce reliable statistics that meet users' needs and inform users and not mislead them. And finally, the third pillar is value, where statistics should benefit the public by informing and supporting decision-making, action and debate. It also means that statistics can be accessed, understood and used by a wide range of users. And the Independent Office for Statistics Regulation ensure that official stats comply with the Statistics Code of Practice. As I said, we should ensure that our stats kind of meet the needs of various users. So we're very happy for people to get in touch with us to discuss any improvements you might like to see in the stats, or if you'd like to have some sort of clarifications on the information presented in stats, we're always happy to have a chat. Kind of shows interest in our statistics. It's good to see that our work's been appreciated. So now I'm going to hand over to Bobby and Amelia, who are going to give an overview of the trends. It's kind of the interesting stuff. So I'll pass over to you now, Bobby.
Thanks, Andrew. I'll just take control of the slides here. And good morning, everyone. As Andrew says, I'm Bobby McKenna. I've been a statistician at Revenue Scotland for the past 3 years. And I'm going to kick off our presentation today just by talking you through some key trends and points looking back over the last decade, specifically looking at residential LBTT and additional dwelling supplement. So we'll kick off with our first basic chart here. It's just a zoomed out view of residential LBTT declared due by month from our first month of operations in April of 2015 up until the last month of the last financial year, which is March 2025. So just before we look at any stats and trends here, for context, the rates and bands for residential LBTT have been static for the past 10 years. So any trends you see in increases are not due to changes in rates and tax bands. They're due to increasing property prices. There's one small exception, which is on this chart, which I will get to. So just looking at some basic bits that we've got here on this chart, handily enough, our minimum value for monthly residential LBTT was in our first month in April 2015. That was 7 million in residential LBTT declared due that month, which we can contrast with nearly 10 years on. In July of 2024, we had 52 million in 1 month of residential LBTT declared due, which is more than 7 times that original figure. The only time we've come close to getting lower than that first month was in April of 2020 when we had 7.1 million in residential LBTT, and that coincided with the first national COVID lockdown. And as I'm sure you can see here, it wasn't long in kind of bouncing back from that, due in no small part to the period I've highlighted in orange here, which is the one exception to the rates and bans rule, where there was a temporary change enacted to the nil rate tax band, which is normally for transactions in the value range of £0 to £145,000. That limit was raised to £250,000 for this period. And you can see in April 2021 when there's a dip back down after that temporary change was reversed. So you can generally see, though, the increasing trend over time, and particularly the kind of sustained increase after the COVID period. Also on this chart, you can maybe see a bit of seasonality. The low points that you kind of see recurring each year, they typically tend to be in the winter. Specifically, February is usually a low point in each year. That comes after a minor spike in December at the end of the calendar year, and before another little spike in March at the end of the financial year. And it's just a general quiet time of the year. The high points during the year, if you look at the sort of M shapes that you can see at the top of every annual cycle, that tends to be the summer months into the autumn months. So we'll go forward to our next slide, which the chart we were just looking at is still here, just grayed out, and I've overlaid that with this dotted chart, which is the number of residential conveyances received over the same time period. And as you can see, it generally follows the same pattern as residential LBTT declared due every month. And the difference is that it's actually on average a bit more level. There's not really an increasing trend here. Now we do have some fairly big spikes and dips. Obviously in the same month when the first national COVID lockdown was announced, we had a big dive down to less than 3,000 residential conveyances. But in December of 2020, we had the all-time peak of over 13,500 residential returns received, and that has never been surpassed since. Interestingly enough, the next month there was a major dive down in January 2021, which was when the second full national COVID lockdown was announced. So perhaps rumours of that incoming lockdown led to people wanting to get their property transactions over the line in this month. So this next slide is basically reiterating what was in our first slide, but just making it a bit easier to see the annual trend. So the data is aggregated by tax year, financial year here. So you can see here that in 2015-2016, we had 202 million total residential LBTT declared due, and in our most recent year, 2024-25, that has multiplied by 2.4 or increased 140%. And you can also see here the general increasing trend with the big jump after 2020. Next, we're looking at the same, the second slide aggregated by year again. So what you can see here is the number of residential transactions compiled by year. And to note here is that this is actually a very steady number. It doesn't vary too much. There's not been an increasing trend, and this is just to show really that the rising residential LBTT is not down to increasing annual numbers of residential returns being submitted. And if we take this slide and the figures from the slide prior and we do a bit of division, we get a fairly basic metric here of the mean LBTT per residential conveyance over the years. And this follows the same trend as residential LBTT per year. So from the first year to the last year, it's about 140% increase. And moving forward, so we've got quite an interesting chart here where we've got the percentage of residential conveyances per tax band in each year. And there's a lot going on, but the things to focus on here, I think one main takeaway is if we look at the top left hand corner of this chart at this 53%, that is in 2015-16, the percentage of residential returns which fell into the nil rate tax band. So that's over half in that first year fell into the nil rate tax band. In comparison to 2024-25, when that has decreased down to just over a third of transactions in the nil rate tax band. And another key thing to look at on this chart, which is important, is the opposite side over looking at the two right-hand side bars. These are the top two tax bands. So in orange there, we've got the 325,000 to 750,000 range. And that sliver at the very far right that you can hardly see in the first few years is the 750,000 plus tax band. So as you can see, in the past 10 years, that has become an increasing proportion of the overall percentage of residential transactions. And that's a really key thing to remember as we go into the next slide, because these two tax bands tend to dominate the total residential LBTT that's received. And the increase over the years in total LBTT as we go along is really driven by this increase here. So as we go forward into the next slide, we've dropped off that dark blue bar, which was the tax-free band, because what we're looking at here is the proportion of total residential LBTT split into the bands from which it comes. So as you can see, the transactions which fall into the 325 to 750,000 pound range really dominate residential LBTT. The bulk of residential LBTT each year comes from transactions in that range. So just flicking back to the previous slide, if we look at 2015, 2016, 6.9% of residential transactions came from that tax band, and almost 55% of total residential LBTT came from that band. And if we look at the most recent year, we've got 18.6% combined of residential transactions come from the top two tax bands. So that's at 17.3% here and 1.3% in 750,000 plus. And that accounts for 83% of total residential LBTT in the year, which is a lot. And if you can focus in even further on just this, the very top tax band, that's 1.3% of residential transactions in the last year came from that. So that's about 1 in 77 purchases. And that accounted for nearly a quarter of all residential LBTT in the last year. So just looking at some sub-Scotland trends here, looking at local authority level, as you can see here, the City of Edinburgh local authority has and always has dominated in residential LBTT. It's way above all the rest of the local authorities. In the most recent year, it accounted for 28% of residential LBTT. And in second place was Glasgow City with 37 million, and that's down to 8%. So there's a huge gap between first and second there. In general as well, you can see most local authorities have seen an increase over the last 10 years. Some have gone up and down, but I mean, particularly City of Edinburgh, that's more than doubled since 2015, 2016. And Glasgow City too has almost tripled. We've included Aberdeen City on this chart just to pick out a key bit of info. Although this has gone up and down over the years, Aberdeen City is actually the only local authority which in 2024-25 had a lower figure for residential LBTT than it did in our first year in 2015-2016. This chart here is showing the number of residential conveyances by local authority by year. And as you can see, City of Edinburgh is still up there very high, but matched and often exceeded by Glasgow City. So this is kind of what you'd expect, but it illustrates that the property prices in Edinburgh are just much higher than in Glasgow because it doesn't dominate by anywhere near the amount that it does. As I said, it was 28% of all residential LBTT last year versus 8% from Glasgow, when in fact there are 12 and 11% of conveyances respectively, and often Glasgow has more conveyances than Edinburgh. And we've also included here some of the kind of runner-up other council areas that often have high numbers of residential conveyances, so Fife, South Lanarkshire, North Lanarkshire and Aberdeen City. So moving on now to ADS, or Additional Dwelling Supplement. This chart here is showing gross and net ADS by year. So the figures that's floating over the columns here is our gross ADS. The figure included in the orange part of the top bar is that which has been reclaimed, leaving us with our net ADS in the purple bottom part of the bar. So that gross ADS of 103 million in 2016-2017, excuse me, has increased 140% to 144% even to 251.5 million in the most recent year, and net ADS has increased by 155%. And one important thing to note here, in contrast to residential LBTT, is that ADS most definitely is subject to rate changes and has been several times over the years, which will be driving some of this upward trend, which I've illustrated in my next slide here. So again, kind of mirroring something we looked at for residential LBTT, where we've calculated the average amount of additional dwelling supplement that someone would be paying if they were due to pay ADS each year. And that follows the same trend really as net ADS each year. But you can see the significant jumps here. So in January 2019, the rate went from 3 to 4%, causing a little bump there. In December of 2022, it then increased from 4 to 6%, causing a larger bump. And most recently, it's gone up from 6 to 8% in December of 2024. Now, this chart here is looking at the percentage of all residential LBTT transactions which incurred ADS, for which ADS was due. That's the figure that's floating over the top of the columns here. So, for example, in the most recent year, that's 21% of all residential LBTT transactions had ADS declared due on them. The other figure that's shown here in the dark blue with the figure inside the bar, that is the percentage of all residential LBTT transactions each year for which, one, there was ADS declared due, and two, that the taxpayer has declared that they don't intend to reclaim that ADS. And we use this as a proxy for second home purchases, buy-to-let purchases, rentals, etc. So as you can see, there's minor fluctuation across the years, but the figures are relatively steady. In the first year, in 2016-17, that 15% accounts for about 15,000 purchases of second homes, rental properties. And in the most recent year, about 17,000 comes from that 17%. And that's a fairly reliable metric, that 17%. When people indicate on their tax return that they don't intend to reclaim ADS, we find that only 3 to 5% annually go on and change their minds and do reclaim their ADS. Whereas the other way around, when someone on their tax form puts that they do intend to reclaim and they do intend to sell their existing property, anywhere from 25 to 35% of that pool of people actually don't end up reclaiming it. So again, looking at ADS, but at the local authority level, we've got a definition here, which I covered, just explaining why we use that as a proxy for second homes and rental purchases if someone indicates they're not going to reclaim their ADS. And Dundee City stands out as a local authority where in the last year, more than a quarter of all residential conveyances were those where there were purchases of a second home or of a rental property at 26%. And Aberdeen City was a close second at 24%. And the lowest percentage was in East Lothian, where only 10% of residential returns meet those criteria. And again, this is looking at basically that same thing, but over time. You can see that we've highlighted the 3 local authorities which are most frequently featured in the highest percentage of residential conveyances where the taxpayer doesn't intend to reclaim the ADS, and those are Dundee City, Argyll and Bute, and Hill and Shire. And the 3 which most frequently have the lowest percentage of what we assume to be second home or rental property purchases are Aberdeenshire, East Renfrewshire, and Midlothian. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Amelia to carry on with our presentation.
Okay, great, thank you, Bobby. So I'm going to be covering non-residential LBTT, a little bit about reliefs, and finally SLFT. So to start with non-residential LBTT, this comes from non-residential conveyances as well as leases and lease reviews. And I've just shown the rates for non-residential conveyances here. So you can see, as for residential LBTT, there are different bands, but also the rates have changed once since April 2015 in January 2019. So looking at the trends in non-residential LBTT over the last 10 years, we've got several lines here for different types of non-residential LBTT. So starting with the top line, this is from all non-residential conveyances. So you can see the trend is sort of quite up and down every year. It's not consistently increasing or decreasing. And that's because non-residential LBTT is really affected by a small number of very high value transactions every year. So that's what the second line on the chart is showing. So the dashed line is just showing non-residential LBTT from the 5% most valuable conveyances. And you can see that that's very close to all conveyances and also following the same pattern year to year. Moving down the chart, the third line, the purple line, is non-residential LBTT from lease returns. And as you can see, that is much smaller compared to conveyances and also relatively stable over time compared to the top 2 lines anyway, maybe a slight increase over time. And the final line on the chart, the dotted line, is LBTT from lease reviews. As you can see, this is a very small value in comparison to the other lines. And there is a bit of an increase in the last year where the value was triple that of any previous year from lease reviews. And just looking at the numbers of non-residential returns as opposed to total LBTT in the previous slide, the top solid line again is all non-residential conveyances, and these numbers are fairly stable over time. Again, the second solid line is for leases. There's maybe a slight decrease here over time, but relatively stable. And in comparison, the dotted line is the lease review returns, and these have increased over time, particularly in the most recent year, 24-25. And there's a few reasons driving this, we think. So firstly, with lease reviews, a review is due on a 3-yearly cycle. Obviously, then the first 3-year lease reviews were due from 2018-19 onwards. And since then, 6-year reviews are starting to become due and 9-year reviews. Also in the most recent year, we issued more lease review penalties, and there was increased compliance activity around lease reviews as well. Having a quick look at non-residential LBTT at local authority level. Again, as for residential LBTT, we've got City of Edinburgh and Glasgow, the top 2 lines on this chart with the highest LBTT. But you can see it's very variable year to year, again, because of those small number of high value transactions. But in every year, Edinburgh and Glasgow are the 2 local authorities with most non-residential LBTT. And looking at numbers of returns at local authority level, again, similar to residential LBTT, I think we've got high numbers of returns from both Edinburgh and Glasgow, but they're much closer to all the other local authorities, which are the grey lines underneath. And in some years, Glasgow and Edinburgh aren't actually the top non-residential LBTT returns. Okay, so just quickly, one slide on LBTT reliefs. So the slide on the left just shows the total estimated LBTT that's been forgone to reliefs every year. And you can see this has increased overall year to year, being particularly high in 23-24 and 24-25. And the chart on the right shows the percentage breakdown by different types of relief. So every year, the largest bar there is group relief, the dark blue bar at the bottom, followed by charities relief and multiple dwellings relief. But you can see that over time, the proportion coming from group relief is slowly decreasing, with a higher proportion coming from other types of relief. Okay, and moving on to our last set of slides, just 3 slides here about Scottish landfill tax. So these are the SLFT rates, and as you can see, unlike LBTT, they do change so far every financial year, always increasing. And we have 2 different rates. There's a standard rate SLFT and a lower rate SLFT, and the standard rate is around 31 times the lower rate. I've also added a point here, just looking at 2025, the change there was particularly high, so rates have really gone up this financial year. And these 2 charts illustrate the trends in SLFT over time. So the bar chart on the left is the SLFT declared due every year since 2015. And as you can see, there is a decreasing trend for SLFT, and that's despite the rates increasing over time. So there was a bit of a blip there for COVID in 2020-21 and 21-22, but overall a decline, especially down into 2024-25. And so as the rates have gone up, the reason behind this decrease in SLFT is that there have been smaller and smaller, lower and lower tonnages of waste being landfilled. And that's what I've shown there in the chart on the right. So the top line's potentially very small label is standard rate waste in the purple. And the lower blue line is the lower rate waste tonnages being landfilled there. So both lines decreasing, particularly a steep decline for standard rate waste. And by the time we get to 24-25, similar tonnages of standard and lower rate waste. And my last slide, this is showing SLFT by different types of waste. So we classify waste by European Waste Catalogue Codes, or EWC codes. And the 2 charts are for the standard rate waste on the top and lower rate waste on the bottom. So for standard rate waste, you can see that the main waste code every year has been mixed municipal waste. And the second most common category is waste from the mechanical treatment of waste, and that's the dark blue bars at the bottom. So every year, those have been the 2 biggest categories of standard rate waste. And then for lower rate waste, the chart on the bottom, you can see that the bottom set of bars, the dark blue, again, is the waste from mechanical treatment of waste. And that has always been one of the biggest categories and has been increasing as a share of lower rate waste over time. And then the 2 other most common types of waste are minerals and soil and stones there. Okay, so I think that's all of my slides.
The data that Fiscal Commission produces helps us to plan ahead as well. So with that, I will pass on to Will Jones, who's going to take us through the first part of the presentation.
Cool. So yeah, thanks Neil, and then thanks Andrew, Amelia, and Bobby for your presentation earlier. That was really useful. But yeah, our part of the presentation, we're going to be looking forward. So just by way of introduction, I'm Will Jones. I'm a senior analyst at the Scottish Fiscal Commission, and I work across all of our tax forecasts. And today I'm just going to talk you through some of those forecasts, and then just give a little bit of insight on the process that we go through to produce them, and also go through how we use the Revenue Scotland data to that's provided to us to produce those forecasts as well. So yeah, at the Scottish Fiscal Commission, we're responsible for producing various tax forecasts and for all taxes devolved to the Scottish Parliament. So that's the fully devolved taxes such as non-domestic rates, LBTT, SLFT, and also Scottish aggregates tax, and also some that are partially devolved, such as Scottish income tax, where the Scottish Parliament only has powers to change rates and bands. And we also provide illustrative forecasts for air departure tax and the assignment of VAT, which aren't yet devolved to the Scottish Parliament. And just also worth mentioning the Scottish Building Safety Levy, which will be introduced in April 2028. Next slide. But today, just as it's Revenue Scotland's 10-year anniversary, I thought we'd just focus on the three taxes that Revenue Scotland collects. And so yeah, that's LBTT, Scottish Landfill Tax, and Scottish Aggregates Tax. So I'll take you through the LBTT forecast, and before I hand over to my colleague Tony, who will take you through SLFT, and then he'll hand over to Alex, who will talk through our first forecast of Scottish Aggregates Tax. And then just at the end, I'll go back to talk about LBTT and SLFT in a Scottish budget context. So these are our latest forecasts, and these are the forecasts that we published in June of this year. So I'll just first touch on the forecast process at the Scottish Fiscal Commission. So we produce two sets of forecasts a year. That's one accompanying the Scottish budget, which is typically in December, and also one alongside the Scottish Government's medium-term financial strategy, which is typically in May. And in each of these forecasts, we produce a 5-year look ahead and for each tax. But just worth mentioning, in our budget forecast, we tend to focus more on the upcoming year for which the budget is being set. And we're currently in the process of producing our next set of forecasts, which will be published in January, as Michael mentioned. This is due to the late UK budget. We usually expect it around a month before, but that just means because we rely on it so much for input into our forecast, the Scottish Government decided to have their budget in mid-January. And yeah, these set of forecasts, the main focus will be on the upcoming financial year, which will be 26-27. And so yeah, just looking at our latest forecast that we published in June alongside the MTFS, LBCT, clearly the largest forecast, as mentioned in the previous presentation, and expecting it to hit around £1 billion in revenue in the current year of 25-26. SLFT revenue has been decreasing over time, and yeah, Tony can talk through a bit about that forecast later. And as I mentioned, our forecast of Scottish Aggregates Tax, that was the first official forecast that we published. Previously, we'd had that as an illustrative forecast, with the tax due to be introduced next April. So now I'll just go on to talk about our LBTT forecast. So as mentioned, it's 3 separate forecasts for the residential, the additional dwelling supplement, and also non-residential. And for additional dwelling supplement, just worth mentioning, this is the net additional dwelling supplement after repayments have been taken off. So that does require us to do 2 separate projections there. I'll focus on residential and ADS mainly for this presentation, but I will touch briefly on ADS just as to how the forecast is constructed. So this is just a quick overview of what our modelling process looks like. So we start with the latest year of full outturn data, which is 2024-25, and this is data that's provided to us by Revenue Scotland. And this data comes in 128 price bins of varying widths as the price increases. And this gives us data from the number of transactions, the total consideration within each price bin, and also the average price per transaction. And then this gives us our base year from which to grow our forecast. And then we within the team, we produced annual growth rates for prices and transactions, and this is based on the latest available data. And we apply various statistical methods, which I'll cover briefly in a couple slides on our latest approach. But for each year of the forecast, we apply these growth rates uniformly across the full distribution. This gives us a base forecast of 5 years of LBTT revenue. And so once we have this base forecast, we can start to look at the in-year data that we receive. So this is data that we receive from Revenue Scotland, and it's so the latest current year is 2025-26, and so we have data up to about September, and we can make any adjustments that the price and transactions forecast might not be picking up. That could be some distributional effects, such as more or fewer transactions at certain price points that we're not picking up. And we're about to receive our granular breakdown of the first 6 months of data from Revenue Scotland, and this will really help our forecast, and we'll lean heavily on it for any judgments that we have to make. And just highlighting there that's the data that we receive from Revenue Scotland, and that fit into our forecasts. And before I move on, I'll just on non-residential, so that the process is quite similar. Obviously no ADS, but our base year, the main difference is, as highlighted by Amelia, the data can be quite skewed by a large number of high value transactions. So we end up taking a 3-year average of the last 3 years just to produce our base year. Otherwise, we could end up with a year that's not the best to base our forecast on. And we also, to grow our forecast, our price and transactions for non-residential, we lean heavily on our economy team at the Scottish Fiscal Commission, who produce our GDP forecast and use that to grow the non-residential. So move on. So this is our latest forecast for June 2025. And I've put the outturn there for context, and also shown you all of our previous forecasts and what they've been saying. So this comes from a table that we produce in our annual forecast evaluation report. And so it's worth noting, from about 16-17 to 23-24, LBCT revenue rose around 10% a year, but there's high year-on-year volatility around COVID, especially. You can see where the LBCT revenues rose a lot in 21-22 and 23-24, and we're currently expecting the forecast to grow at an average of around 8% a year, so slightly lower than what's happened over the past 10 years. But I think given the how much prices grew in that COVID period, I think that's a reasonable assumption. And a lot of this comes from our prices and transactions forecast. So we're expecting prices to be about 16% higher than in 24-25 by the end of the forecast period. And for transactions, that's around 11%. And so for our transactions approach, what we've done is based on a mix of simple statistical modelling in the short run. And there's a historically typical level of turnover in the medium to long run that we peg our forecast to. So this is based on turnover, which is the transactions as a share of the dwelling stock, and that's typically around 1% a quarter that we expect that to occur. And then for prices, again, it's another mix of statistical modelling for our short run forecast, and then towards the medium point of this forecast, there's some econometric modelling, and then towards the end of the forecast, we peg to the growth in nominal household income. And also worth mentioning rates and bands. So for a lot of our other forecasts, we assume that thresholds will rise with inflation. That's an assumption we make across the board. And if the Scottish Government inform us otherwise, then this would count as a policy change. But for LBCT, the rates and bands are actually stated in legislation. So for our forecast, we keep them fixed across the whole forecast period. And so I think as prices increase, we would expect there to be a fiscal drag effect where more overall tax is being paid in the higher rates. And this is something we saw in the previous presentation, where the amount of overall tax being paid at the top two rates increased as time went on. So now I'll just pick out one of these previous forecasts just to give a bit of an idea of what happened 2 years ago. So in our December 2023 forecast, you can see in the outturn that in 2023-24, the LBCT revenue was going down, and this was a decrease in prices and transactions, and we were expecting this to continue into 2024-25, and the reasons being, given the average mortgage rates, we're expecting them to double from the 2022-23 rate when interest rates were starting to rise, and also from our economy forecast there was stagnant household incomes. So this led us to forecast a drop in prices and transactions, and subsequently a drop in LBCT revenue. And this was in line with the wider consensus as well, where particularly the OBR and Bank of England were all forecasting a similar decrease. But it turned out mortgage rates, they did rise, but not quite as much as expected, and incomes ended up growing. So this led to an increase in price and transactions instead. And in our latest valuation report, we're reporting £120 million error in our forecast, which is fairly large, but as explained why that occurred. But we already corrected our course in the forecast prior to receiving outturn data. So that's the year on in our December 2024 forecast, because we saw the data on prices and transactions was already rising. So we didn't have to wait for the outturn data to know that this would happen. But just an example of how difficult it can be to forecast LBCT, especially when we're in a downturn, or were in a downturn. So now I'll just move on to additional dwelling supplements. So this again is our latest forecast from June 2025. And just again, a reminder, net ADS, that's after repayments have been taken off the gross ADS figure. So we're forecasting quite a large jump in 2025-26. And the combined effect of the increased prices and transactions from the previous, I just mentioned on the previous slide. But this is also when the rate of ADS rose from 6% to 8%. So now this is an example of a method we use to adjust our forecasts based on the in-year outturn data, something I mentioned on an earlier slide. And this is gross ADS in 2025-26. So we've got the latest outturn data there on the purple line, and just comparing that against our June 2025 forecast for the in-year forecast, and right at the end there, we've got an expected total for 2025-26, and we've calculated that based on the historic share of monthly ADS or gross ADS data. And so I think you can make a reasonable assumption that the June forecast is doing a fairly good job for gross ADS, and but the total's slightly down. So I guess in practice we'd probably apply a very small downwards adjustment to our forecast based on this. But I think the main message to take away from this is that the gross ADS forecast is looking in line with what we expected in June. So then it's worth taking us to repayments. So once we take repayments off gross ADS, that gives us net ADS. And worth bringing you back to April 2024, when the repayment window for repaying ADS was extended from 18 months to 36 months. So previously our 18-month approach was based on outturn data. So that purple line there is what we've seen over the past 10 years or so. So we often have to make assumptions and judgments when a policy change occurs. And but when this extension came in, we decided that we made the assumption that repayments would begin to come in at a slower rate, but there'll be more overall. And we also looked at the repayments data for the higher rates of Welsh land transaction tax, as there's already been a 3-year repayment window there, and that was another bit of data that informed our judgment. just worth looking at the latest outturn data. So this is all the data we've received since April 2024, shows that there have been a much larger amount of repayments than our current modelling approach is expected. And so this would reduce net ADS by a larger amount than we're currently expecting in our forecast. Worth noting, this is still fairly early. This is only 5 quarters of data, and we haven't seen the full picture for the 36 months. But and we don't have a clear reason behind why this is happening. It could be the recent rate rises that have happened alongside it. The ADS has risen from 4 to 6 to 8% in recent years, or it could be wider market conditions as well. But yeah, this is adjusting. We want to be careful not to overreact to this data, and this is something we'll be considering in an upcoming forecast, and a pretty good example of the sort of thing that we'd discuss with our commissioners. So I think that's the end of LBCT. I'm just going to hand over to Tony now to talk about Scottish landfill tax.
Hi everyone. So yeah, thank you, Will. My name's Tony, and I do the Scottish landfill tax forecasts at the Scottish Fiscal Commission. So just sort of an overview of Scottish landfill tax. It's sort of the smallest tax that is currently devolved, and as was sort of touched on by Amelia, it sort of has decreased over time. In terms of how we do the modelling for the Scottish landfill tax, it's actually pretty straightforward. If you break it down to sort of the main component parts, we forecast the rates of Scottish landfill tax exactly the same way the UK landfill tax forecast their rates, which is essentially use RPI to uprate future rates. The thinking behind that is that you want Scottish landfill tax to match UK landfill tax to prevent sort of waste tourism and sort of there being sort of asymmetric changes in the tax system between the two countries. In terms of how much waste actually goes into landfill, it's also pretty simple, particularly well, with regard to standard rated waste, which is the vast majority of the component of Scottish landfill tax. All it is sort of total waste that we forecast minus incineration capacity. Incineration capacity has sort of been vital in terms of dropping the overall waste that's gone into landfill. But unfortunately, sort of unlike other things that we forecast at the SFC, it's basically predicting infrastructure. So we don't have, obvious determinants that we can use to predict when they'll come online. Sort of anyone who's had work on their house done knows that sort of timelines you get for sort of building things can be a bit shaky sometimes, and that's very similar in terms of incineration capacity. But it certainly has been the leading cause for why there's been significant drops over the course of Scottish landfill tax being devolved. Waste is the most complicated aspect of what we forecast and is where we use the Revenue Scotland data most. So we use Revenue Scotland data to basically produce our base year forecast, which is any quarterly data we have in year times a sort of quarterly assumption that we get from previous years, also provided by Revenue Scotland. That generally sort of historically that has shown that sort of the first 2 quarters of a year tend to be a little bit larger in terms of waste produced in Scotland than the last 2 quarters. And then we also use various other assumptions that influence future waste rates. So sort of slight increases in recycling capacities, and then we also use sort of household consumption and GDP in order to sort of forecast the whole period, the sort of 5-year period that we use at the SFC. Oh, and also just to touch on, as we mentioned, there's been this sort of BMW ban that sort of comes into place at the end of this year, and previously got mentioned, there's been a slight change in how it'll be administered. But once that comes into place, how we have forecast it in the past has been essentially disregarding incineration and then just forecasting the type of waste that we believe will continue to be landfilled at the standard rate. So that is waste that would be legal to be landfilled and cannot sort of feasibly be burnt. So just in terms of the change in the profile of the Scottish landfill tax forecast, it's really been incineration capacity that has been driving the big drop, as I mentioned. So here is a sort of comparison between past incineration capacity increases alongside standard rated waste that's been landfilled. So as you can see, as one goes up, the other goes down. Sort of fundamentally, every time there's a new incineration capacity, providing it's large enough, there's sort of quite a step change in how much waste gets sent to landfill. But then again, this can be very sort of temperamental. So for example, recently there was a sort of a 6-month delay in quite a large site coming online. This is sort of explained why there's quite a large increase in Q1 of this year for Scottish landfill tax, and it's not something that is sort of particularly easy to predict. Our methodology tends to be sort of looking at it with a bit of a skeptical eye, doing various things to sort of hedge risks, but ultimately predicting when exactly they'll come online is very difficult, as is predicting when things like they go offline occasionally for maintenance, which is hard to say when will happen. Increasingly, as the overall amount of waste reduces in terms of Scottish landfill tax, this is sort of a larger component of risk in our forecast. And there's sort of, as there's more incinerators built, there's more components for failure, so that risk is slightly increased. But ultimately, as incineration rises, landfill decreases. And so this is just again, so yeah, these are our sort of past forecast against outturn and our latest forecast. Sort of the initial large drop you see that was initially expected around 21-22 shows the original point at which the BMW ban was supposed to come into place. This sort of didn't happen. It was delayed by 2 years. But as you can sort of see at the beginning of the period that we were forecasting, we tended to sort of forecast a bit high. More recently, we've been forecasting a little bit low. And sort of our current fall forecast is followed by the dashed line. And just to go over the BMW ban a little bit, as it's sort of very important in terms of the future of Scottish landfill tax revenue. Sort of a basic overview is that it's sort of waste that decomposes and sort of gives off methane. I sort of thought it's more environmentally beneficial to have this waste burn as opposed to be in the ground emitting sort of that greenhouse gas. And essentially what it means is that the majority of waste that's currently landfill will be illegal to landfill. The main component of this is just sort of black bin waste that everyone sort of takes out in their home. In terms of our forecasting, when the BMW ban comes into place, we've previously forecasted that it just disregards incineration capacity and that we're forecasting a type of waste. So the fundamental forecast sort of changes in terms of what it is that we're looking at with a large amount of interest. And that is the Scottish landfill tax forecast. And I think I'll pass on to Alex.
Yes, hi. So I'm going to take you through, sorry, my name's Alex. I am, among other things, responsible for the Scottish aggregates tax forecast. And this is obviously a new forecast because it's a new tax. So we previously produced an illustrative forecast, but we've revised that to sort of a full forecast, and I'll come on to the difference between those in a moment. But I guess let's start just with what are aggregates. I have tried to jazz up the slide with a picture of some aggregates. I'm not sure I have succeeded, but aggregates are sand, gravel, and crushed rock. The tax technically applies to all rock, and then anything that isn't in those categories pretty much is removed from it by exemptions or reliefs. There is already a tax on the activity. It's aggregates levy, which is a UK-wide tax, but it will be devolved from the 1st of April next year. And a sort of crucial fact about it is that it's going to be based on the location of, so technically the location of where the commercial exploitation takes place, which broadly speaking, it usually means the location of the customer. So one feature of that, it's for a start consistent with the treatment of imports and exports to the UK as a whole. So imports are a tax and exports ultimately are not. But also it has the feature that it is harder to have sort of tax rate shopping. So it's harder to, if you are the customer, you can't say, I'm going to get some aggregate from England instead of Scotland if the English rate happens to be lower, or vice versa. Because either way, if you're in Scotland, you should pay the Scottish rate. And that's really important as a distinction to make, because Scotland is a net exporter of aggregates. So these are point estimate data, I should clarify. So this is from the Aggregate Minerals Survey, a big survey conducted by the British Geological Survey on behalf of the UK, Scottish and Welsh governments. Because of that, it doesn't cover Northern Ireland, but it does cover Great Britain as a whole, and we can see Great Britain is very slightly a net importer of aggregates, but Scotland exports a lot more than it imports. A lot of that comes from one quarry in the Highlands, I believe, Glensander, which is directly attached to a port. So that means that the aggregate can be immediately loaded onto a ship. It's not really as economically viable to move aggregate. It's so heavy by land, but by sea it's a lot easier. So because Scotland is a net exporter, that means that if we look at sort of the production, the ratio of production, we will overestimate how much tax we paid. So that leads though onto the challenge we have with the data for this. So obviously Revenue Scotland is not currently collecting this tax because it doesn't exist, but the UK-wide tax does. HMRC collects data on that, but they collect it on a company level. And the problem there is that, I mean, even if the companies were based in, a company was only quarrying in Scotland or was only quarrying in England, which isn't the case. There are companies that cross the border. But even then, if there were any movements across the border, we wouldn't be capturing those. So we have information on how much aggregate, how many tons of aggregate are taxable, but we don't have in the outturn data for the existing tax a nice way of dividing it into Scotland and the rest of the UK. So the first thing we can do is look at production. The UK Minerals Yearbook is published annually, as you might imagine, and you can see Scottish production is a relatively small share of the UK, but as you might expect, again. But as I sort of mentioned on the previous slide, that doesn't quite tell the whole story, because we would be overestimating how much actually will be subject to the tax. There isn't the same kind of degree of annual data for the movements, but we do have the Aggregate Minerals Survey that was taken relatively recently. So our approach is to adjust the yearbook figures to try and account for those imports and exports. And if we do that, get a it looks a fairly small change, because on a sort of UK-wide level, maybe it is, but given as a portion of the Scottish band, it's quite a bit. So I think it's about a third of the revenue that would be there from a production-based share. I think it's more like a quarter. Sorry, I am going to, yes, some percentage. Apologies, I've completely gone blank on that. But yeah, it's a not insignificant proportion, and so that does lead then when we compared our forecast to. Sorry, that's not it. When we compared our forecast to our previous illustrative one, which was just based on the quarrying share, we revised down our estimate of how much would be raised. I will now hand back to Will, who will take you through some slides on the Scottish budget.
Great, thanks Alex and Tony. So yeah, just got a couple more slides to finish off our presentation, just on the net position, and this just a quick explanation of what a net position is. So it shows the net contribution of each tax to the Scottish budget, and for a devolved government it's one of, or if not the most relevant measure of the budgetary impact of a tax. And it's calculated by comparing our own forecasts of Scottish revenue to the OBR's forecasts for the rest of the UK, from which the block grant adjustment is calculated. And a block grant adjustment, they essentially simulate how much revenue would have been raised in Scotland had the tax not been devolved. And it has the effect, for taxes, it has the effect of removing funding from the Scottish budget. So, so this is the latest net position for LBTT, and so just a positive net position here means that the tax is a net contributor to the Scottish budget, and that is definitely the case for LBTT. So for 2025-26, which is the year we're currently in, the net position is around 400 million. But as you can see, the net position is decreasing based on the latest set of forecasts to around 150 million by 2029-30. This is largely, I mean our forecast of Scottish revenue for LBTT is increasing, but the OBR's forecast is that underpins the BGA is increasing at a faster rate, and that's largely because they've got faster growth in transactions in the rest of the UK. They've got higher assumed rate of turnover, and there's also, I think a lot of this comes from the effect of England-specific planning reforms due to come in over the next few years. So this is based on our, this latest net position is based on our June forecast compared to the OBR's March forecast. So next week the OBR will publish a new set of figures, and so the block grant adjustment will change. And of course we're producing our January forecast, so the Scottish revenue will also change. So it'll be interesting to see how that net position moves once we have the new set of forecasts for LBTT. And then just finally on SLFT as well. So yeah, the net position is negative across the whole forecast period, and especially so. Just to note, this is before any the forecast doesn't contain anything around the latest CEPA enforcement. So this is our forecast from June. So yeah, the biggest difference is in 2026-27, which is the first year of the BMW ban. But then from 27-28, the BGA reduces, and the OBR are forecasting more waste incineration infrastructure in England, and that reduces the amount of waste sent to landfill, and that has the effect of reducing the BGA. So the net position gets closer to zero, but it is still negative. So it has a negative effect on the Scottish budget. So I think, yeah, that's the end of our presentation. So I'll stop sharing the slides and hand back to Neil.